first excerpt I'll read is sort of near the beginning of the book, where I'm just talking about my feelings about going back to Nigeria as a child. So, as a teenager, I virtually had to be escorted by the ankles onto a Nigeria Airways flight at the start of the summer holidays, not only because I wanted to avoid all that airport angst, but also because I didn't want to reach the ultimate destination. Having to spend those 2 months in my unglamorous, God-forsaken motherland with its penchant for noise and disorder felt like punishment. I wanted a real holiday, riding banana boats in Barbados or eating pizzas by the Spanish Steps, just like my school friends. But my parents didn't have the money or the inclination for that sort of thing. We're going home, they insisted, with the firmness of people who knew better than to waste exotic travel on the very young on a regular basis. So come July almost every year, I would pack my bags and prepare to serve my annual sentence in a country where the only development I witnessed was the advance of new wall cracks and cobwebs, and where growth simply meant larger damp stains on the ceiling. Nothing ever seemed to change for the better politically or economically in 1980s Nigeria. I would arrive at an airport that hadn't been refurbished in 20 years. The humid viscous air, pointlessly stirred by sleepy ceiling fans, would smother me like a pillow and gave a foretaste of the decrepitude and discomfort that lay ahead. Back then, when international flying was considered the height of sophistication, many of the child passengers were dressed as if attending a black tie event. Parents tarted up their little girls in frilly party dresses. The boys sweated it out in bow ties and dinner jackets, while armed thieves, otherwise known as government soldiers, rummaged through everyone's luggage at customs. Only in Nigeria could you see machine guns, tuxedos, army fatigues, and evening frocks together at an airport. The insane aesthetic summarised my country's vanities and bathos more clearly than anything else, and it depressed me. I wanted out. I wanted to go back to the place I called home, leafy Surrey, a bountiful paradise of Twix bars and TV cartoons and Leylandii trees, far removed from the heat and chaos of Nigeria. I was a toddler when the family moved here in 1978. It was during the oil boom, when the Nigerian currency, the naira, enjoyed close parity with the British pound, and the middle-class Nigerian life could easily be transferred to England. With plans to give us English schooling, my father settled the family in the UK while he continued to work in Nigeria as a property developer, writer, and businessman. For months at a time, our family was headed by our homesick mother. She cooked plantain and grappled with central heating and the other novelties of English life. We watched Sesame Street and scribbled naughtily on the walls when not scanning the fridge for snacks. But the luxuries of English life were not what my father had brought his children to England for. We were here to get an education, and he was terrified that we'd all gone soft, which is why our summer returns to Nigeria often sometimes included a brutal acculturation fortnight in our village. The experience was a character-building one, in which we were forced to live without electricity, running water, and, the most egregious of deprivations, television. It was a tropical gulag. Nameless aunts and uncles would claw lovingly at our faces and mock us for not speaking our native language fluently. "Obegruawa," they would deliberately ask us, cackling at our non-response. For dinner, they fed us intensely savoury dishes such as ground rice and okra soup, eaten by the light of a kerosene lamp and washed down with body-temperature Coca-Cola. Then at bedtime, we provided the meals for an invisible but frighteningly audible army of mosquitoes and sandflies. By dawn, our arms were covered in itchy lumps that looked like strawberries, only bigger, and our fingernails had turned black from the nocturnal scratching of sweaty flesh. Having a cooling shower was the only incentive to get up and face the new day, but even achieving that was a chore in itself. You had to fetch the water first. We didn't have to trek all the way to the river, but the jerry can still needed to be dragged from my grandmother's house 20 metres away from ours, which wasn't easy when the water weighed more than we did. Concerned that all this suffering wasn't sufficiently authentic, my father later instructed my grandmother to take us everywhere she went. We were to shadow her every move to get a true taste of village life. But she interpreted this diktat more literally than my father intended and tried waking us up for pre-dawn prayers. Faking sleep, my siblings and I cowered against the hot, sticky bedsheet as her lamplit silhouette banged against the window and called out our names. "Zina, no, Tedum, Ake, wake up." I've never suffered such cold sweats in such a hot place. By contrast, my parents believed that without their country, they were nothing. My mother habitually referred to our Surrey residence as the house. Nigeria was home, the place where her parents and siblings lived, where her wilted energies blossomed and her pale skin toasted to its original brown. At home, she sparkled in Nigerian traditional clothing rather than battling the British winter in woolens and thick overcoats. At home, she was no longer the alienated housewife, but the madame, handing over laundry and shopping lists to the servant while she caught up with old friends. My father's patriotism was even more fervent. He carpeted our hallway in green to match the colour of the national flag, and once interrupted a crucial TV episode of Little House on the Prairie to teach me verses of the national anthem. It was a pointed stand against our Americanisation, and even our passports remained resolutely Nigerian as a snub to gold-dusted British citizenship. One year, when I was 12, my father tried to instill a love of his country in his children by taking us on a road trip to see the beautiful side of Nigeria. From our hometown of Port Harcourt in the south, we travelled north into the interior. My sister, younger brother, and I sat in the back of our Peugeot 504, or Peugeot 504, as we say, while our father puffed on his pipe in the front passenger seat and hummed to Richard Clayderman, a deeply uncool classical pianist who performed covers of 1970s pop songs. Our driver, Sonny, who hated those tinkling Bee Gees and Barbra Streisand covers, drove in agonised silence through the Central Highlands. Throughout the trip, we were repeatedly reminded of how lucky we were to travel in this way. Very few Nigerians have seen as much of the country as you, my father would say, as we went to the Yankari Game Reserve or to the new capital city Abuja and to Jos and to Kano. But I was too young to grasp this privilege. Fun as the trip was in part, I still wasn't sold on the country. Had someone told me then that the holiday of 1990 was to be our last in Nigeria, I would have performed cartwheels down the street. Little did I know that the reason for our future absence would be so grim. Do I have time for two more or one more?
Two more, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is just a portion about religion in Nigeria. So if there's a country more religious than Nigeria, then I haven't been there. According to the Bible, God made the earth in 6 days and took a rest on the seventh. But by creating Nigerians, he ensured that was the last day off he's ever had since. 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, we call upon his services, connecting with him, singing his praises, establishing dialogue with him, an extremely loud dialogue at that. In my time in Lagos, I had heard hairdressers singing their hallelujahs at salons or evangelical radio stations resounding in internet cafes, and bus passengers collectively breaking out into ovine choruses of Jesus is my father, he never, never fails me. Television brought little respite. Whenever the electricity miraculously flowed in Auntie Janice's house, I would flop onto the sofa to savour a football match or a music show, only to be lulled out of my square-eyed stupor by a pastor barking down a microphone at the start of the Divine Connection Hour and other such broadcasts. Nighttime was no haven either. One morning, as daylight diluted the inky sky and the humidity had receded enough to allow me to finally sleep, I was woken by a man walking down the street outside, preaching the gospel at the top of his voice. Temptations of the flesh and the evils of promiscuity were his main themes. "You no want for sexing. You no want for sexing," he bellowed into the cool dawn. I couldn't hear the rest of his sermon because he was sauntering down the street, allowing residents of each house to catch only portions of what he said. Had he been serious about spreading the good news, he might have chosen to stay in one place and let everyone in the vicinity hear his message in full. But he wasn't concerned about this. The act of imparting the message was his main motive, a conspicuous show of piety that bordered on the self-indulgent. All of this was evidence that God's love is spreading, Christians would say. My view of the situation was perhaps less nourishing. Years of economic struggle and political corruption seemed to have focused Nigerians' attention on God more strongly than ever before. I noticed these changes in some members of my extended family. Religion anaesthetizes the pain of bad transport and low wages and stuffed ballot boxes and candlelit nights. In the decades since democracy was restored in 1999, people's anger seemed to have faded into a muted resignation that shied away from staging street protests. Instead, they developed strategies to earn more money, selling items on the side or begging relatives and friends for loans and donations. But above all, they pray for salvation from life tribulations. Half of Nigeria's population, concentrated in the north, is Muslim, but among the other half, evangelical Christianity, especially the Pentecostal kind, is thriving. But not the kind of religion that's materialistic, that's spiritual. It's the materialistic kind that's the problem. So this charismatic, fundamentalist form of Christianity originated in the 1920s. Focusing on a direct relationship with God, its adherents affirmed their faith through the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues, a strange babble understood only by God. Their interpretation of the Bible is a more literal one, with a strong emphasis on abstaining from alcohol, gambling, extramarital sex, and other vices. Charismatic Pentecostalism began to flourish in the 1980s as Nigeria tumbled into an economic abyss. On IMF orders, General Babangida had introduced a harsh economic structural adjustment policy aimed at cutting government spending and opening Nigeria's markets to imports. It ended the decadence of the oil boom years and brought on a nightmare of high unemployment and even deeper poverty for the ordinary man. Out of this emerged an educated elite with a strong, highly conservative message. These Pentecostal Christians believed that being born again, i.e. living a life of spiritual purity free from sin, one could be saved from going to hell and enjoy a healthy and successful life on earth. Pentecostals set up new churches that branched away from the colonial Catholic and Anglican churches. The preachers were entrepreneurially savvy and well qualified, often former lawyers, professors, and doctors. Inspired by American televangelists, they ran their churches like businesses. Worshippers were promised that by becoming born again and making generous donations to the church, they would be blessed with health, wealth, and good luck. Pentecostal ministers are seen as prophetic figures, responsible for passing on God's words to followers. They're self-styled faith healers, problem solvers, doctors, and philosophers and economists all rolled into one. They offer the gospel as a cure-all for every ill, their services focusing on divine healing, exorcisms, and the performance of miracles. Call it what you will, prosperity Christianity, health and wealth gospel, Nigerians are highly receptive to its message. Around 20 million people now belong to a Pentecostal church, pouring money into its bulging coffers and turning some churches into highly lucrative concerns. The ministries, some of which specialize in certain types of healing, such as finances or fertility, are run like commercial enterprises. They manufacture books, CDs, DVDs, and merchandise stamped with their own logos. These churches have proliferated like mice. A handful of large ones enjoy million-strong congregations, but the other 1,000 or so ministries are generally tiny, established by anyone who wills it. For every legitimate ministry, several are run by charlatans seeking enrichment of the non-spiritual variety. Competition for adherents is fierce, yet their wealth isn't frowned upon. My sister once came across an article in the Nigerian society magazine Ovation, titled The Jet Set Pastor, in which a wealthy church leader posed for photographers in the plush interiors of his mansion. His wealth may very well have been legitimate, but such affluence often evades suspicion because, much like in the gold-encrusted churches of 16th century Europe and South America, in the Pentecostal mind, wealth and virtue are intertwined. Pentecostal pastors are nearly always the founders of their church and the focus of attention. Thousands of worshippers gather in stadiums or convention centres to listen to their sermons. The preachers prowl and strut around the stage like R&B stars, using their charisma to spread the gospel and rouse the congregation into a frenzied spiritual orgy. The miracles they perform are something to behold. The blind can suddenly see. Sex freaks discover monogamy. Paraplegics stagger out of their wheelchairs for the first time since their car accident. In Lagos, not a week goes by without one of these evangelical events taking place somewhere. They're promoted like rock concerts and given lavishly worded pseudo-intellectual titles such as the expository and systematic revelation of victory over worry and anxiety. On the streets are countless billboards featuring these star preachers looking extremely dapper in their silk ties and boxy Italian suits with handkerchiefs poking neatly from their breast pockets. Their shiny faces stare down at me with toothy, camera-ready smiles that might twinkle if I stared at them long enough. Such stylishness seemed rather disquieting. After all, Jesus, The Prophet Muhammad or Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi, Aung San Suu Kyi aren't renowned for their snappy dress sense. The preacher's presentation is unmistakably American in influence, though some intellectuals argue that their message of prosperity is rooted in traditional African animist religion, which has always sought material gain from the gods. Either way, many Nigerians see Christians as a fail-safe conduit to financial prosperity. Yeah, I'll just stop there. Going on to, and then the final section is when I go back to the village, my village banner in Ogoniland. And this is, I'm just reminiscing about the time that when we buried my father. We got his remains about 10 years after he died, finally. And so we'd had his sort of mock burial in 2000, where we buried an empty coffin. And then when we got his remains, we went back to Nigeria in 2005, and then had the real burial. Okay, so I'm with my driver, Sonny. He was my father's driver as well. So deeper into the village, the tarmac stopped and the road became sandy. The heat bludgeoned me as I climbed out of the car outside my father's white bungalow. It stood close to the unpainted, windowless church on the edge of his parents' compound. My grandfather's two-storey house towered above the surrounding bungalows belonging to some of his 6 wives, including my grandmother. All of them are dead now. Their graves filled up the compound, converting it into a graveyard of sorts. That's the tradition. We bury our dead next to their homes. My father, however, is buried in a public field in the village as a tribute to his struggle. His body had been dumped unceremoniously in a unmarked grave after he and his 8 colleagues were murdered by Sani Abacha's regime. It had taken some years to retrieve the remains. We had to wait for democratic elections and then ask the government to locate the grave, and then finally the bones were identified through forensic tests. In 2005, my brother Junior and my sister Zina and my half-sister Sinto and my uncle Owens and we prepared the remains for burial. As Junior brought out the large bag containing our father's dissembled skeleton, Zina cried out loud on the far edge of the room. Sinto watched silently through her tears. I decided that the situation was only as macabre as my mind would allow, so I forced myself to lift out a long bone wrapped in newspaper. Uncle Owens, who's a medical doctor, helped us to identify and arrange each femur and fibula and metacarpal and rib, settling our minds into a more industrious mood as we assembled the skeleton. Before long, everyone was helping out. It was hard to conceive that these coarse brown objects we held in our hands were our father, a once energetic man with dark, stocky flesh. In vain, I searched for his face in the skull now resting at one end of the coffin. The 2 front teeth were missing. How and why, I don't know. But when Junior placed a pipe between the upper and lower jaws, his teeth metamorphosed into that familiar smile. My father was always the one who made the decisions in the family, but now we were taking charge of him, deciding the fate of his remains. When I think of the day he showed me the architectural drawings of the bungalow we were in 20 years previously, I doubt he ever imagined we would be using one of the rooms as a temporary morgue. It now made the house uninhabitable in my view, and I certainly wasn't going to spend the night there by myself. So my grandparents' compound was outside. My grandparents' compound was silent and empty, except for the odd goat and sporadic children's game. I was used to visiting Banner with one or both of my parents in the days when the machinery of hospitality seemed to grind into action of its own accord. But now that I was on my own and my grandparents were all dead, there's no one to greet me or feed me. And as I pottered around, examining all the graves, I recalled my cousin Ketiwe once telling me that she felt little reason to visit Bane now that our parents were gone.